Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to see such a large crowd, a lot of interest in this topic I see. There are a few seats, there are about 3 seats in the front row if people from the back would like to come forward or anybody who doesn't have a seat would like one. Please make yourselves comfortable. Thank you for spending your lunch hour with us today. A very warm welcome to the United Nations Bookshop. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to our Meet the Author event to discuss the book Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. A very special welcome to our Undersecretary General for Global Communications, Ms. Melissa Fleming. It's nice to see you with us today. My name is Sherry Aldis. I'm the Chief of United Nations Publications in the Department of Global Communications. Welcome to those watching us on Facebook Live today. Please do feel free to like and share any of our social media. We're using the hashtags on the screen behind us here, UN Bookshop and Global Goals. Bonjour à tous et bienvenue à la Librairie des Nations Unies. Nous sommes heureux de vous accueillir aujourd'hui pour une discussion autour du livre Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. C'est un honneur pour nous d'accueillir Madame Caroline Criado Perez, l'auteure du livre, ainsi que Madame Nala Valji pour mener la discussion. Nous serons ensemble pendant environ 1 heure pour entendre plus sur le biais inhérent contre les femmes dans toutes les données qui informent nos politiques, notre infrastructure et donc nos vies. Nous allons continuer en anglais, mais si vous souhaitez intervenir en français lors de la partie interactive, surtout n'hésitez pas. It is truly an honor for us to host Caroline Criado Perez, the author of Invisible Women today. Ms. Criado Perez is a best-selling and award-winning writer, broadcaster, and feminist campaigner. She has a degree in English language and literature from the University of Oxford and studied behavioral and feminist economics at the London School of Economics. Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men exposes data bias in a world that is designed truly for men. From policy to product design, from health to music and everything in between, our lives are based on data that is inherently biased against women. As you can imagine, the implications of that are incredibly wide-ranging, and the cost is borne by women. It impacts all of the Sustainable Development Goals, directly on SDG number 5 on gender equality, of course, but all 17 SDGs are tracked using data collection and analysis. Thankfully, this important work is getting a lot of attention and has won such prestigious prizes as the 2019 Financial Times and McKinsey Business Book of the Year Award and the 2019 Royal Society Science Book Prize. We are very grateful to our colleague, Ms. Nala Valji, for joining us today and helping us to organize this event. Thank you, Nala. Ms. Valji is the United Nations' first ever Senior Gender Advisor in the Executive Office of the Secretary General. She coordinates the Spotlight Initiative, the largest global investment in preventing the pandemic of violence against women in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and she supports the strategy for achieving gender parity in the United Nations. So we'll be together for about an hour this afternoon, starting with about 25 minutes of discussion between Caroline and Nala, and you will have an opportunity to ask any of your questions for about 25 minutes at the end, after which Caroline, thank you very much, will stay to sign some books for us. So thank you. Over to you, Nala.
Can you hear me at that? Yes, perfect, wonderful. Welcome everyone. As Sherry said, thank you so much for spending your lunch hour here with us today, and thank you to Caroline for being with us. For those of you who work here at the UN, you might be interested to know that Caroline is with us today because she's been spending the morning with some of our senior leadership who are for the first time having a day-long retreat on gender equality and the United Nations. And so Caroline's really been helping to lay the foundations for that discussion this morning, so we're doubly grateful that she's here. I think as you can tell from the packed room and the standing room only, there's a real sense of excitement about this book, and Sherry mentioned that this is the first time ever that there's been a queue for book signing before the event has even begun, so I think you have a sense that this is a book that's really resonated. And I know that for many of us who work in the area of gender equality, when this book came out last year, it was like the holy grail, 350 pages of statistics, data, and evidence to make the case for what we try to say with gender equality, which is that this is not an add-on checkbox exercise. It really is about how we see the world, how we construct the world, and how we construct the solutions and outcomes as a result of that. So just to say, your book really has resonated, I think, with many people. But I'm going to start off and turn over to you with a three-part question.
Okay.
The first is, what led you to write this book? The second is if you could give us a bit of a summary of the key point of the book. And the third is a few of the concrete examples across the range of areas that you look at that really help us to understand the way in which this bias plays out.
Okay. So I sort of feel that the book came about because of how I became a feminist. And that ever since I became a feminist, this book, it was inevitable that I was going to end up writing it. And the reason for that is that how I became a feminist was I discovered that default male was going on in my own head. Prior to that, I'd actually been pretty hostile to feminism. I didn't grow up a feminist. For those of you, if there are any people in the room here who were growing up in Britain in the 90s, you will know that feminism was very much a dirty word at that time, and I really bought into that. I thought that women had equality, and that feminism was just an excuse for women to be able to complain about them not really putting in the effort, them not choosing to strive, them not being interested in, politics, in leadership. I had a very low opinion of my sex, and it wasn't until I went to university as a mature student when I was 25 that I really had to engage with ideas of gender. And I had to read this book called Feminism and Linguistic Theory, which I know sounds like not the top contender for light bulb moment book, but it was my light bulb moment book. And it was specifically this section on grammar, again, slightly odd. But it was about the generic male in language and using he to mean he or she. And I think, like a lot of people who don't know much about feminism, I had heard that feminists complain about this. And I think also, like a lot of people who don't know much about feminism, I just dismissed it as so trivial. Really, this is what they're going to complain about. Everyone knows it means he or she. Haven't they got something more important? It just felt embarrassing to me. I didn't want to be associated with it. But then I read the next thing in this book, which I'd never heard before, which is that when women hear these words, they picture a man. And that completely blew my mind, because I realized that I was picturing a man when I heard these words. And the thing that really got me was, I was 26 years old by this point. I'd clearly been picturing men for decades. How had I never noticed that I was always picturing men? Why was I not picturing women? If these words were really gender neutral, why wasn't I, as a woman, picturing men? And it just shocked me so much that this could be going on without my even being aware of it. This thing in my own head. And it really just set me off questioning everything. And I really started thinking about this very low opinion I had of women and where that came from. Because I didn't know any women like this. I didn't know any women who were just completely superficial and trivial and not interested in the world around them and totally consumerist and over emotional and hysterical. All the things that we paint women as. But somehow I just believed it. And so I started thinking about the representation of women. And I started thinking about how I had been taught basically about men all my life. The history I'd learned was about men. The books I was told to read were by men, about men. When I was taught about science, it was presented to me as if all the discoveries ever had been made by men. And so I started to think, well, if you look at it that way, is it any surprise that I have this low opinion of women? So really that's where, that's kind of my personal story, and that's where my sort of obsession, I would say, with the default male came from. It was just a very, very personal thing that I just felt so angry, actually, that I had been fed this myth about my own sex, so that I felt embarrassed of being a woman, basically. I felt that every person I met I had to convince, well, I'm not like other women, I'm pretty cool, actually. Ignore the boobs, that's just, So that's where it started, and I think because that's how I came into feminism, I was really primed to notice every time I saw the default male crop up. So I got, first of all, very interested in representation, because that's how it had personally affected me. That I realized whenever I was, because, I realized that it wasn't just when I was hearing these words, like, he meant gender neutrally, it was actually also any time a person, a human being was referenced and the gender wasn't specified, I was picturing a man, lawyer, doctor, professor, writer, journalist, all of these words, every single time I was picturing a man. So I got very interested in how important it was for women to see women, so that they didn't internalize this misogyny that our culture is so infested with. But then I started to see that actually it existed in these more even more damaging ways. I mean, I think obviously it's very damaging for women's sense of self, but then I started noticing, well, this actually is how our entire economy is structured, for example. It is being designed around this human who represents the traditional male life, i.e. an individual with no attachments, no caring responsibilities, who just maximizes his own self-interest, and that's how he makes decisions, and that's how we should structure the economy, to account for individual humans who are making decisions in this way. And this individual is called Homo economicus, which of course is male. Then I sort of discovered it went even deeper than that in fact GDP, this number that we hold up as the representation of the economy, this is what's going on. It is a number that we don't question, that is just presented and still is today. It's reported in the news as this is the GDP of this country. This is how big the economy in this country is. And yet it's missing the entire amount of unpaid work that women do, which is a huge contributor to the economy, and without which the formal economy would not function. It requires that childcare is done, that the house is cleaned, that the groceries are picked up, that the clothes are washed, that lunch is made. All these things that happen invisibly actually have an economic value. And in fact, when the decision was being made about what GDP was going to look like, there was a discussion about whether women's unpaid work should be included, because there's never been any, it's never been disputed that it has an economic value. But ultimately it was decided, and this is a really repeated theme I came across in my research, that it was too complicated to measure. And that really is something that came up again and again and again. Women are just too complicated. Our bodies are too complicated. Our work patterns are too complicated. Our travel patterns are too complicated. Everything about us is too complicated. Which really, again, only really makes sense if you're not thinking of women as half the world. If you're thinking about us as this sort of niche minority, this sort of subspecies of male, which is kind of how historically and subconsciously we continue to think of women. So that there was that, and then I discovered refugee policy. So the UN Declaration on Refugees, which is obviously this incredibly historic, important document, which was drawn up with the best of intentions, after World War II, the idea being that no one should ever be rendered stateless again, and that you shouldn't have to stay in a country where you're being persecuted. But when you look at this gender neutral, presented in a gender neutral way document, you realize that there are all these stipulations that will affect men and women differently. So, for example, having to flee the country that you are being persecuted in before you can claim asylum. Well, that's so much more difficult for a woman than a man. It's much harder for a woman to get a visa to travel legally because, she may not be working, or she may be coming from a country where women cannot travel on their own. And what if the person that she's being persecuted by is the person who's meant to be accompanying her? Then if a woman even does manage to leave, as I'm sure you all know all this, but you can't just rock up and say, hey, I'm being persecuted, give me asylum. You have to be able to prove that you're being persecuted for a set number of reasons. And those include, sexuality, political affiliation. But the number one reason that women will give you for why they're being persecuted is because they're a woman. If you talk about something like FGM, that's not because of their political belief, that's because they're female. But gender and sex are not one of the tick boxes. So these tick boxes have been designed according to what it's like to be a refugee as a man. And yes, women can be persecuted for these things, but essentially, for a woman to successfully claim asylum, she basically needs a lawyer. So a lawyer can argue that the persecution that she's experiencing somehow explain how it fits into political belief, or somehow explain how it fits into social group. And I think the next, I mean, there were other examples that I came across, like of course peacekeeping and security, and women in prisons, the way that prisons have been designed for the male experience of the criminal justice system. But the sort of final straw that broke my back and forced me to write this book was discovering the gender data gap in the medical world. And I just found that gobsmacking. You know, it was when I was writing my first book, and I read this paper that talked about how women are more likely to be misdiagnosed if they have a heart attack, because women don't necessarily experience the typical male symptoms. And I read that and thought, what? I didn't know anything about female-specific symptoms, and was A, shocked that I didn't know about this, but B, shocked to discover that doctors were also not necessarily recognizing when a woman was having a heart attack, and sending her home telling her she had indigestion, when in fact she had had a heart attack. Or another example would be that so sometimes women will present with the classic chest pain, but because it may actually be mechanically different in the heart, some of the diagnostic tests that she will be sent for if she presents in this way won't actually pick up the issue in her heart. And so women, even if they present with chest pain, can be sent home with undiagnosed chest pain, even though they've had a heart attack. Obviously, in both these cases, these women can go on to die. And the other thing that I read was that in animal trials, female animals aren't being included because female animals are too complicated. Female animals are just too hormonal. Can't deal with that. And to me, as someone who didn't have a strong science background, this was so incredibly shocking. The way that we talk about science today is almost as if scientists are elevated above the rest of us. We're all sort of useless idiots down here, and the scientists are these super rational, objective, neutral people who just deal in facts, and they pluck the facts out of the air and they present them to us. And to discover that actually scientists are just like the rest of us, and that these facts aren't existing in the air. They are so intertwined with what questions we choose to ask, like what even is the problem we're trying to solve, how are we going to try and solve it. All of this is affecting the data that's even being collected. That just made me so angry. Partly because it's shocking that women are dying, because we still insist that female bodies are too complicated to study for medical research, but also that this wasn't being spoken about. This wasn't a huge talking point. I couldn't believe that women were dying and this wasn't on the front page of every newspaper. So I just basically lost my temper and wrote this book. So I'm trying to remember what the three-part questions were. Why I wrote the book? Okay, good.
A summary of it and some examples, which I think you've done. And I think the examples that you chose for us, everything from refugee law to medicine, really demonstrates just how critically important this is, how it affects our daily lives and how it affects everybody's life. So you are here at the United Nations, and of course, refugee work, humanitarian assistance, development, peace and security, these are all critical areas of the work that the UN does. And you write specifically in your book about peace and security and post-conflict. You also write about post-disaster rebuilding. And of course, this year is the 20-year anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in the Security Council. We're increasingly seeing, because of climate change, increasing disasters. Can you tell us a little bit about what are the implications of the male default bias with regards to post-conflict recovery, with regards to disaster and post-disaster? And what does that mean for our work and what we need to be seeing and doing differently?
So one of the frustrations about post-conflict and post-disaster is that there is a sort of general consensus often that we're in a crisis, okay? Can the ladies just shut up and let us get on with it? You know, this idea that gender is a distraction from, you know, the main issue, that it's this little side thing that we can deal with later. You know, there's that sort of very famous phrase, you know, we'll get to the women after the revolution. And that's basically the way that we seem to often act in a crisis mode. We retrench, we go back to traditional ways of doing things. And it seems reasonable. You know, if you don't think about it very hard, it seems reasonable. Yes, we've got more important things to be worrying about than whether the women are included. Like, we're trying to save lives here. The problem with that is that lives are more likely to be lost if you don't address gender in these moments, because actually women's lives are most vulnerable in a post-conflict situation and most vulnerable in a disaster situation. And that is not because women are inherently weaker, it's because the societies that we live in position women in ways that mean that they're less likely to be able to survive, and they're more likely to be heavily impacted. So, you know, when you look at the research into disasters and how women are more likely to die in certain disasters, that's because of socially organised issues. Like, if, for example, the cyclones in, where was it? I think it was in Bangladesh. So I interviewed for the book a disaster relief specialist, and she was explaining to me why women were more likely to die. And it was this series of things that had nothing to do with you know, biologically. It was all to do with social reasons. So first of all, women weren't even getting the warning, the cyclone warning. Why? Because the cyclone warnings were in public spaces. And so the women were reliant on the men to come back and say, hey, there's a cyclone, you better get to the shelter. And they weren't getting the message. It was as simple as that, they just didn't know. Second, the cyclone shelters themselves were not built with an idea about gender. So they were just these big spaces, mixed sex, and if the women went in there, they were getting sexually assaulted. They were seen as easy women because they're mixing with the men. Or, you know, or they wouldn't go in there because they didn't want to have a bad reputation. You know, they had to choose between saving my life or saving my reputation, which can be the same as saving your life in the you know, after you survived. Is it worth surviving if you're going to be ostracized for the rest of your life? They didn't provide animal shelters in these cyclone spaces, and animals were the responsibility of the women, and so the women would stay to look after the animals. And then after, in the disaster relief after the cyclone, they built these homes, and they built them without kitchens, and they built them without animal shelters. Again, you know, both these areas that women are responsible for. And so you see from the beginning to the end, from, you know, surviving the cyclone to being able to live in the post-disaster scenario, if you haven't accounted for gender, all these ridiculous things happen that make women more likely to die, or make them unable to pick up their lives and carry on afterwards. This isn't just in a development context. You know, this has happened repeatedly, for example, in the United States. After a hurricane in Miami, actually there was a We Will Rebuild post-disaster something like that. And it was entirely focused on getting the business district back up and running. And so women set up their own Women Will Rebuild, because women didn't just need the major downtown area to be fixed. They needed to, you know, be able to take their kids to the doctor. They needed to be able to take their kids to school. They needed to be able to go to work. You know, all these areas that hadn't been thought of because we focus on the formal economy, not the informal economy. And then the lessons were not learned from that. And exactly the same thing happened in the rebuilding after Katrina, which also, by the way, you know, I'm sure you all heard about the awful things that were going on in the shelter in Katrina, but the same thing happening with sexual violence because there wasn't consideration given to gender. And again, this is also something that happens in refugee camps around the world, where if you don't provide sex-specific toilets with adequate lighting and adequate security, women can't go to the toilet because they're going to get raped or they're going to get groped at, best. And so you have women developing all sorts of health problems because they can't go to, this basic thing of going to the toilet, because we still, despite all the data, don't seem to have got it into our heads that this is something that needs to be provided in every single refugee camp in the world. You have to have female-specific toilets, and they need to be well lit, and they need to be well secured. It's not difficult. We know this. We've known this for a really long time, and yet we carry on forgetting it, because in a crisis zone, we're just trying to save lives. This gender thing is just really muddying the waters here.
Great, so I know that there's going to be tons of questions, but just before we open it up to everybody, I have one last question for you. So you say in the book that there are 3 ways in which the male default bias misses the experiences of women. One is women's experiences of violence. The other is the fact that women give birth. And the third is unpaid care work. And this morning in the retreat, you gave an example of the way in which missing the unpaid care work implicates itself in policy, and as a result of that, in public transportation policy, as one example.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So the example that I was talking about was to illustrate the importance of not just collecting sex disaggregated data, but it's also really important how you analyze it, and to question the assumptions that you may have before you start to analyze the data. So in transport, the traditional way that transport data has been segregated has been transport for paid employment is all put together in one big block, and then you have all these other sections like transport for education, transport for shopping, transport for escorting. And what this transport planner in Madrid realised was that what was happening there was that all the travel that women did for their unpaid care work was being split up into these separate categories and mixed up with leisure travel, so that it looked like, I'm going to draw a little diagram here for me. So this is the way it looks in a traditional transport table, like that. So you've got paid employment is the biggest reason people are traveling, and then there's all these little things, right? And women's unpaid care work travel is lost in all those smaller areas, and you've got, so, women going grocery shopping, which is unpaid care work, is mixed up with, I don't know, some guy going and buying a sports car, which is arguably not unpaid care work. I don't know, depends whether you're transporting the kids in your nice sports car or not. Anyway, so what she did was she took the unpaid care work travel that was separated out and mixed in with the leisure travel, and she put it all together in one block as well, and the table ended up looking like that. And she found, therefore, that women's unpaid care work there was almost as much travel for women's unpaid care work as there was for paid employment, and also it was the #1 reason that women were traveling. And the reason that is important is that if you look at a table like this, it seems absolutely reasonable and correct that you should design your public transport system around facilitating paid employment, because that's why people are traveling. But then if you look at that table, suddenly it doesn't become so clear, especially if you are interested in increasing your female labour force participation rate, because the unpaid care work has to get done. It's non-negotiable. And the reality is that it is mainly still women doing it. Women do 75% of the world's unpaid care work. They do something like 3 times as much childcare, 4 times as much housework. So that's going to happen. That has to happen. And unless you account for it in your infrastructure, so, that is your public transport, but it's also, your zoning, where is the business district, where is the residential district, where are the doctor's surgeries, you aren't helping women to combine their paid and unpaid work, and if you don't help women to do that, they drop out of the paid employment system.
Thank you. For those of you who can't see the boxes at the back,
Yeah.
when you
And really very important diagrams here, very scientific and true to life, to scale.
Thanks, Caroline. With that, let's open it up to the audience. We have some wireless mics here that can be handed out. I see we've got a couple up here in the front to start.
Oh, while you're asking questions, can I just say someone's pen someone came up and asked me to sign their book and lent me their pen and you didn't take it back. I don't want to steal your pen, so it's here, should you want it later.
Thank you so much. It was I've been reading the book for the last couple of weeks actually, and it's really nice to hear it brought to life by your voice. I'm Cindy. I work in internal evaluation here in the UN. How do we get the conversation started with people who are men, let's say, who you can't see, you don't understand what you can't see. So, for example, I'm sure many, if not all, of the women in this room have walked down a street that was slightly dark, and you worry.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never once talked to a man who has who can even
Mm-hmm.
have a sense of that feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a fact of being a woman in this world, and all of the examples that you have in your book and you talked about today. How do we start that conversation with a group of people who just don't even necessarily see that's a problem, apart from giving them your book?
Yeah, I mean that is the answer. I do actually think the data is the answer to that, and it's funny you use that as an example because it is an analogy that I often make of. I think it's quite different. I mean, it must be basically impossible, I think, for someone who doesn't know what it's like. It's not just about, walking down the dark street. It's that you're risk assessing all the time. Like, everything you do has got this little voice in the back of your head going, do I go down there? Or how is this person going to react if I do this? Like, you're constantly risk assessing. How do you get someone who doesn't have to think like that all the time to empathize with that? I'm not sure that it's possible. There was this sort of reaction after the initial Me Too, where some men, hashtag not all men, some men were outraged at the idea, wait, you mean I've got to start thinking about what I say? Yes! That's what women have to do all the time, because we're trying to keep ourselves out of danger. I'm not sure how possible it is to get people who don't experience that to understand that, because it's a whole different way of thinking and maneuvering around the world. But everyone can understand women are 17% more likely to die if they're in a car crash because cars have been designed using a 50th percentile male car crash test dummy. You don't have to have experienced a car crash to be able to see that is just ridiculous, or the medical data. So I think that presenting it in terms of statistics that show that when we don't collect data on women and when we don't factor women into decision making, these are the effects, is a really good way of people understanding it, and is one of the reasons I wrote the book. I wrote the book because I was angry, but also I wrote the book for people like me before I read my feminism and linguistic theory book, people who don't get it, and I wanted to help people to get it. So, you don't have to get them the book. There are articles. You could send them the Guardian extract. But I do think that data is the way, because if you are, it's much harder to explain a sort of emotional reaction, which is kind of what the risk assessing is, than it is to explain, a bald fact like women are more likely to die following a heart attack. Yeah.
Hi,
Yes. Take a few questions.
Okay.
thank you so much, Caroline.
Come.
For this exciting and very timely, important study. My name is Yusuna. I'm from Gender Team at UNDP. I have two questions. One is how you handle cyber violence and harassment that I'm sure you deal with regularly at a personal level, and what recommendations, policy recommendations you would provide. And my second question is in the context of the Beijing Plus 25, which I'm sure you're aware is 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform on Action for Gender Equality, how you think the needle has moved over this period, and has it?
Any other hands?
Hello, thanks so much for this. It's really great to hear about all of the examples. I was really struck by what you said about disaster management. One of the things that I think about a lot in my work is I think there's a fundamental idea that some deaths are like more important to prevent than others, depending on the cause. So if you, in a disaster, people are dying from malnutrition, that's more important than that they get killed by their partner in that context. And I wonder if you have any reflections, advice, thoughts about how do we get to the heart of that fundamental assumption? Because actually I think a lot of the people in these contexts that are working on this do have access to the data. They can see the prevalence of gender-based violence, they can see some of the gender risks that face people, but there's this deep down belief or norm or attitude, I don't know how you describe it, that actually still means the resources go to the other thing.
Hi, thank you for being here. I wonder how you think your research or your outlook changes when you take into account issues of intersectionality. I say that because there's that idea of the ideal male figure that guides all of those scientific research, but I think that maybe the ideal woman, if that's the goal that we're moving to, could also be problematic for a diverse community or diverse society.
Okay, so cyber violence policy recommendations. Wow. So yes, I have experienced my share of cyber violence. I was subject to a sort of stream of rape and death threats for about 3 weeks following a campaign I led to have a woman on a banknote. So that was weird. But yeah, there were some people who were very angry enough to want to rape and kill me for suggesting maybe just one woman, one historical female figure on an English banknote. I won, they lost. So yeah, that's my policy. That's my policy recommendation number one. Win. That pisses them off. Yeah, more seriously, I think part of the problem with cyber violence is a lack of diversity in the teams that have been designing these spaces. And that is not because they are bad people, it's because they didn't even think about it. And that is what is at the heart of so many of the issues that you come across when it comes to bias in favor of men, is that well-meaning people just, I say people, well-meaning men just don't know what it's like. It's like the walking down the street thing. Most men don't even know that it's happening. Actually, one guy got in touch with me after reading the book, and he said that he'd spoken to his partner, and as a result, talking about the book, she told him that she never goes running after dark. And she never mentioned it to him because it was just so obvious to her. Obviously, I don't go running after dark. Are you crazy? Whereas he goes running after dark all the time. They'd never spoken about this. He didn't know that was a thing. You know, he now knows that it's a thing, and that's an important part of it. One example I talk about in the book that I think is really interesting was these two guys who created this virtual reality game, and this woman played it and she got sexually assaulted while playing it. You see, virtual reality, it felt real, it was pretty unpleasant. And the way these two men responded was exemplary, right? They wrote this long blog post, sort of obviously saying how sorry and shocked that they were, and explaining what steps they had taken, and they had made it so that it would never be able to happen again, and they thought really hard about how to make it feel empowering rather than disempowering for women to be able to prevent this from happening. So it was a really thoughtful post. But one of the things that they said really struck me was, how could we not have thought about this? You know, we thought about having this bubble around your head because we thought about some annoying person trying to block your view. But we didn't think about someone actually trying to sexually assault you. I think it's fairly clear why they didn't think of it. It's not in their experience. The problem there wasn't that they're bad people who, you know, should have known. The problem is that they should have got some women in. You know, that was their mistake. So that is essentially what I think needs to be done. We have to take diversity in technology much more seriously. And this goes way beyond cyber violence, obviously. It goes towards the future that we are currently essentially outsourcing to private companies who are developing algorithms in a totally opaque manner that are increasingly running our lives. And the problem with that is that the data that we have that actually exists is far too incomplete to be able to create algorithms that are not going to be hugely biased and entrench biases like racism and sexism. And I'm sure you've all heard of the examples of, for example, policing algorithms that are biased against African Americans in America. What's it called? Facial recognition software that only recognizes white male faces. And as this starts to get worse and move, or get more common and move into even more into hiring and promotion than it already is, or even into the medical field, that's incredibly concerning. And one of the reasons it's incredibly concerning is that there is not really any evidence at the moment that these companies have a real handle on how urgent the problem is. They are just continuing to develop their algorithms seemingly without any reference to the society in which those algorithms are going to be operating. So for example, I read a paper that came out a couple of months ago about an AI that is supposed to be able to diagnose heart attacks 5 years before they happen. Gender neutral heart attacks, great. Except of course, we have known for 20 years that there are big sex differences in the diagnosis and treatment of heart attacks. And so for example, there are different risk factors. So for example, diabetes is a higher risk factor for women. Smoking is a higher risk factor for women. But when you look at these studies, the studies that the algorithm was trained on, they were heavily male dominated. And the paper itself provides very little sex disaggregated data. So from what you can see, it looks like here's yet another algorithm that is being produced that claims to be gender neutral, but has not factored in the sex differences that it would need in order to actually be gender neutral in its effect. And the really scary thing, of course, about algorithms is that they don't just reflect back the bias that you feed them in the data, they amplify it. So another study, this was looking at an algorithm trained on images, found, so they use basically the most commonly used image data set. And this data set has a bias in that pictures of cooking are 33% more likely to include women. But by the time the algorithm was done being trained and was labeling these images, the disparity had increased to 68%. What that meant was that pictures of men were being labeled as female just because they were standing in front of a stove. 33% to 68%. Obviously, a man isn't going to die because an algorithm mistakenly labeled it as female. Unless, of course, that algorithm is determining what medical treatment that man is going to get. And then suddenly it's much more worrying. So that's my cyber comment. Blah, blah, blah. How does, sorry, my handwriting is appalling. Yeah, I can see that. Beijing 25, how's the needle moved and has it? Obviously things have improved to a certain extent. You can't deny that there have been certain changes, but ultimately the problem that I see as being at the heart of so much gender equality is this mindset. And that ties into the question that you had about some deaths being more important than others. How do you explain that? Well, there's two ways you can explain it. You can explain it by saying some people just hate women, which I think is not a very pleasant way to think about it. I prefer to think about it as the way that I think about how medical researchers justify not including women because they're too complicated. And that only makes sense. It only makes sense if you think that there are fewer of these, that these are a kind of minority, these are niche. So until we change that viewpoint, we're going to continue having these problems until we really get across that, as ridiculous as it sounds, that women make up half the world, we're going to continue having these male bias issues, because while we continue to see men as neutral and basically gender neutral, and women as gender specific and a bit weird. Like basically women are men with a gender. That's essentially how we view things at the moment. Men are the type, the base, and women are, they've got boobs and pink. Like that's. And, you know, it sounds ridiculous, but be honest with yourselves, that's how we think. And we've thought like that for millennia. You know, this goes all the way back to Aristotle. My favorite quotations is from Aristotle's biological treatise on the generation of animals, where he says, the first departure from type is that the offspring should become female instead of male. The male is the type, female is the first deviation. He believed that the female body was a mutilated male body, and that, you know, females were an aberration. This continues through to, you know, Renaissance and the explosion of medical drawings. It continues through to today, but it goes back a really long way. And the reason I emphasize that is because it's important to understand, you know, how heavily entrenched this is in our ways of thinking and the systems that we've developed to build the world. So specifically to answer the question about the deaths, again, this is when you're talking specifically about partner violence, it's that traditional separation of world into public and private, with the assumption that the public is more important than the private. The private is for solving within families, and the state shouldn't get involved. The state should only be bothered with the public, forgetting that, you know, women are more likely to be in the private sphere than the public sphere, and the state has a duty to protect them. So for me, that ties into, I mean, I'm aware I'm a broken record at this point, but for me that really does tie back into this idea of the male experience as the default human experience, the universal human experience, and the female experience as somehow slightly weird and non-universal. You know, I mean, it's not a million miles away, or in fact it's exactly the same thing as when you hear female screenwriters, for example, talk about how they couldn't get their film made because the producers said, this story is too niche, but you can get a film made about, you know, a male cook who likes mice, right? Like, it's just the most niche story in the world, but if he was a female cook, it would never get made. The one other thing I'd like to add to that is it's not just partner violence. One of the things I found most frustrating about my research in post-conflict and post-disaster in the development context was how people sort of forget that women will carry on giving birth even if there's been a tornado, and that therefore you have to provide for that. And maternal deaths go up enormously, simply because we think, well, gender is this separate thing that we don't need to worry about. So it's, you know, it's added to that. Yeah, I mean, absolutely, the data needs to be disaggregated, not just by sex. And the data there is just non-existent, basically. Where there is disaggregation, it tends to be it tends to sort of play in the default male route again. So you get like data for people of color and data for women, with women of color, you know, lost within those two larger groups, so that you can't make specific policy recommendations because it just hasn't been disaggregated. And it was really frustrating, actually. I kept coming up against this brick wall where I just couldn't say anything about specific groups of women, because I was lucky just to get women at all, and most of the time there wasn't even that. So it is a really important area. If you look for, I mean, there are obviously some areas, like for example maternal deaths in the United States, where I think it's African American women are 243% more likely to die than white women. It's obviously clear why you need to have that data. It wouldn't be good enough to say women are this, you know, women have this amount likelihood to die in America, because you'd be mixing up the white women and the African American women, and obviously there's this big disparity. You need to look into why it's so much worse for African American women. So absolutely, that needs to happen. It isn't happening.
Thanks, Caroline. I think we've got time for 2 more quick questions, and I see some hands right at the back there as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Just to follow up on the last point on segregation, I'm Jessa from UN Women. Basically, yes, indeed, I'm a gender statistician as well. So we've often been faced with that challenge and disaggregation, and there are very few cases that we are quite successful in providing further disaggregation on simultaneous sex and age, sex and migrations, sex and household composition. But I think the constant challenge as well, even if you're successful in that point, is to how to mainstream that as a topic of discussion, how we are able to advocate and communicate that to our target audience. I mean, statisticians might be good in calculating, but we would always have struggle in communicating this to our target audience. So any helpful advice would be great. I mean, we're doing this work under the UN Women, making every woman and girl count, and that would be extremely helpful for us as we assist other countries in doing so. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Louie. I'm also from UN Women Research and Data team. So yeah, a lot of the things you're touching on are really important to the work we're doing. My question is, to what extent does your book talk about trans women and non-binary gender identities? And when you're talking about women, to what extent is that including trans women? When you're talking about gender, to what extent are you thinking about that beyond binaries? I think, I don't know a huge amount about you, but I was just doing a small Google and saw that, some trans women have felt that your understandings of feminism and the things that you have advocated for have been exclusionary towards them. So I just wondered if you could clarify that. And just a short example to illustrate what I mean. Within the US and lots of places around the world, trans women are targeted for violence, especially trans women of colour, and there are huge data gaps in that, and that's for many reasons, but one of the reasons is misgendering upon death, and these people not being recorded as women, and that also being influenced by structural racism and many other things. So yeah, I would appreciate your thoughts on that.
Okay. I also have a question. Hi, thanks for your words already. My name is Inga, I work with UNOCHA. I have a question regarding the audience, because you talk about invisible women, how you will make them visible for people or like give hints to people in decision-making power, mainly male-dominated, still this field, and in this audience we can see that's pretty much female-dominated again, and when you want to make them visible, basically, and when you want to show your statistics and your fields, like how do you feel that you reach beyond the female crowd or the female identified crowd? Because you're basically preaching to the crowd and not making them visible to decision makers.
Okay. How to communicate? Sort of about how to communicate data. Essentially, it's about stories. It's about turning the data into stories, and that is not always easy. But I think this is where we need to be, as conscious about collecting qualitative as quantitative data, because it's bringing those two together that I think really makes it possible to communicate, beyond an audience of statisticians, which is a crucial thing to do, and to reach beyond the people who already know that this is a problem. You need to explain how this relates to them, how this is something that isn't just about numbers and academia and something that they'll never have to think about and they'll never have to read about, but something that actually someone might write about in a newspaper and that they would experience in their daily life. So I'm not sure how helpful that is, but that's what I wanted to try and do with the book, was to get people to see how this was relevant to their own lives, and the best way that I felt doing that was, I think my mic's gone, but, no, that's one too. They're kicking us out. Because it's 2 minutes to go.
Hello. Oh, sorry, that was very loud. I've now forgotten what I was saying. Anyway, hopefully that was helpful. In relation to trans and non-binary identities, essentially, you know, you're absolutely right, there's a huge data gap there. Part of the problem is that we haven't yet come up with a way. I mean, I've been talking to sort of data statisticians about how to address this problem, actually, that we aren't collecting specific data on trans people. And I actually think it's a huge issue that is going to be happening fairly soon within the medical world, because, you know, people don't know how to treat trans people. Like, they don't know how to, you know, if someone is taking hormones, how that might impact and interfere with the treatment that they're being given. What we do know is that hormones do interfere with treatment. You know, as I said, we don't like to research female bodies because the menstrual cycle will interfere with the results. Like, we know that hormones have an impact. We also know that sex has an impact. So, for example, there was one study that I came across that was kind of infuriating to read, which was about if you expose male and female cells to estrogen and then expose them to a virus, the female cells were able to use the estrogen to fight off the virus. The male cells were not able to use the estrogen to fight off the virus. What a lot of researchers will tell you when they talk about, you know, if they sort of say, okay, fine, maybe we should include women, they'll say, well, we'll start off in men, you know, the standard default human, and if we find anything interesting, we'll add women later. You can obviously see the problem there, that if we had started off only in male cells with this estrogen trial, we would have assumed that estrogen didn't do anything, you know, and how many treatments for women have we missed out on at the cell trial stage, sorry. I'm a bit jet lagged. So essentially there's just not enough data to be able to say what the impact is going to be for all sorts of things. And what first needs to happen is for there to be a universally agreed set of guidelines for how to collect data on trans identities before we can actually start to deal with any of these problems. And as far as I'm aware, no one's actually managed to get those guidelines together yet. So they're just, you know, you're right, there's a huge data gap there. I forgot what the last question was, I'm sorry. Oh yes, preaching beyond the choir. I mean, that was why I included data in the title. I was like, well, men will probably pick up a book that has data in it. And also, as you can see, like, there's pictures of men on the cover. So that was my cunning plan, my cunning ruse to get the men excited. And it's worked, I'm pleased to tell you. Men are reading the book. Actually, no, it's been really, really great how many men as well as women, have got in touch with me to tell me that, you know, as a result of reading the book, they have changed, for example, the research that they're doing, the questions they're asking in their research. There was one guy who's really stuck with me, who got in touch, and he's an Alzheimer's researcher. And Alzheimer's, as I'm sure you know, is a very female-dominated disease, partly because women tend to live longer, but actually there are reasons beyond that we just don't know. Which is quite normal for female-specific, or like diseases that affect women more than men. We tend to know much less about them. So like there's much more funding for erectile dysfunction than there is for PMS, even though PMS is much more common than erectile dysfunction. We know much more about diabetes than endometriosis, even though endometriosis is actually more common than diabetes. How was I saying? Oh yes, the Alzheimer's researcher. Anyway, so he got in touch with me to say that as a result of having read the book, he suddenly realised something he'd never noticed before, which was when he was being sent clinical data sets, they used male as the default. Now that's interesting for two reasons. One, as I said, is the disease that affects women more than men. But two, data tends to get presented in alphabetical order. And so you would expect actually female to be the default. And so what's fascinating about that is that someone is going in and reordering the data. And the reason that's fascinating is because it's just not credible to suggest that there is someone who is thinking, I know how I'm going to screw with the women, I'm going to reorder this clinical data. It's so clear that it's just this, well, obviously the male is the default. You know, it's this bias, again, rearing its head subconsciously, so that we assume that the male is the universal, the male is the gender neutral, and the female is the effect. And that's how it was presented. You know, male is the baseline, and female was used as an effect. Anyway, so he said he went back and he redid 260 pages of code with female as the default. A small victory, but a compelling one. I hope you agree. So yeah, it has definitely reached out beyond necessarily the usual suspects, which was exactly my plan. You know, as I said, I wanted to give people that sort of sharp wake-up call that I myself experienced when I realised this thing was going on in my head and I had absolutely no idea that it was happening. You know, which was so shocking to me, and I think also very difficult for someone to come to terms with. You know, we like to think of ourselves as objective and neutral, and we're very sophisticated, and so to accept that actually our thought processes are driven by things that we're not necessarily in control of is quite difficult to accept. So yeah, the reception has been great.
Caroline, thank you so much, and I think that last point is a really important one, that you know, this bias is universal. It's not just bias that men have as they're looking at data. As you said, the reason that you chose to write this book was because you realized your own bias and how that was impacting your perceptions of the world. And I think that's why this book is so important, because it really is perception changing, and perception change is the first step to outcome change. So for all of you who haven't bought your book yet, there are copies at the register. I highly recommend it. As you can see, I've bought 4 myself. And Caroline will be with us for a few minutes to sign copies after this as well. So thank you all for being here, and Caroline, thank you.